Give it our width of 40 pixels again. I have to hit refresh over here. Okay, we're back where we were. Actually, this logo is looking a little small. Let me try 60 pixels. Yeah, I think I like that size better. At this point, I think it's a perfect opportunity for you to continue practicing styling this page. Obviously, this page is really small in its scope. And so before we just push forward, I would like you to spend at least a few minutes styling up this page, making it look a little bit nicer, add your own flair to it. In fact, I actually did that and put maybe 5 minutes of styling into it, which obviously shows it's not going to win any design awards. But I did change the font to use a Google font. I added this little box shadow under our nav bar. I moved the footer down to the actual footer section of our page, the bottom of our page, and added some really basic styles to it. So this is a great opportunity not only for you to flex your CSS skills and get your hands on the keyboard and do some practice, but also to interact with the Scrimba community, especially on Discord. Once you've styled something up that looks, well, pretty much anything's going to look better than this. Once you have some kind of style added, take a screenshot and share it in Discord. As you make changes to your code here in Scrimba, it will create a note that you can save, and you can even share that on Twitter. You can share the link to that in Discord, whatever it takes for you to get involved with the Scrimba community. Once you've had a chance to apply some of your own creativity to this little page, the next thing we're going to do is clean up our code here, where right now we have everything kind of stuffed into our index.js file, and we're going to learn how we can move these components into their own folders and clean up our code a bit. There are practically innumerable ways to organize your projects, and so I'm hoping to, in this screencast, just teach you some of the principles, and as we go through the course, you may see different methods that I use, and of course, as you look at other people's code, you'll see the ways that they use as well for organizing their code. Now, what we have here is a very small site for React. There's hardly anything here. I barely have 50 lines of code to make this page. However, anything substantial that you have will end up being hundreds, more likely thousands, or even tens of thousands of lines of code in total. So it's really important to have an organization system that makes sense to you, to your group, and something that you agree upon in the beginning and stick to as you continue to develop. So I'm going to show you with separating one of these components into its own file, and then I'm going to give you a challenge to do the same for the others. So what I'll do is work on the header, and we're going to move header into its own file. So I'm going to create a new file in my Explorer up here called header.js. A convention that I personally like to stick to is that any file I create that will essentially house a React component will start with a capital letter, the same as the component's name itself. Now I'm going to copy, or actually cut, this entire component out, and over in header.js, I'm going to paste it. Now, there's a couple things I need to change here. I want you to pause the screencast and see if you can think of 2 things that I need to change in this file in order for me to then be able to import it into this file so that it's working the way that it was before. So take a good look at this, pause the screencast, see if you can figure that out. Well, remember, in order for the program to make any sense, of JSX, I always need to import React from React. Even though we're not explicitly using capital REACT anywhere here in my code, for JSX to work, I will need to import React from React. Again, this is something that has recently changed. If you're working in an environment that is actively using the updated React 17, then you may not have to do this. The other thing is currently this component is completely stuck inside of this file. I'm not sending it outside of this file anywhere. And so I need to export it. And oftentimes, if this is the only component that I'll have, I choose to export default the component. So I'll say export default header. Alternatively, I could save myself a little bit of lines of code here and just put export default function header right up at the top, and then I don't have to create a separate line down here that does it separately. Personally, I kind of oscillate between these two, so you can just choose whichever one you think you prefer the most and stick with that convention. If you're feeling a little bit rusty on export, import, export default, and so forth, you may want to spend some time researching import and export in ES6, because we will be using it quite a bit in this React course. Now that I have exported my header component, it means that over in my index.js, I can import it, and I'll say import header from, and then I have to use /H header, and I could say .js, but that's the default extension for imports, so I don't need to specify .js. In this case, / is a way to indicate that I'm talking about a file in my own project here, not a package that's in my dependencies like React and React DOM. And I have to make sure that I spell this the exact same as my file name, not necessarily the name of the component. I could have chosen to call this head like that, and I still would have to say import header from /header, or in this case, I could say import whatever because I'm doing an export default. If that's confusing, don't worry too much about it. I prefer to keep the names all the same so that I don't run into any confusion there. Okay, we'll put an extra line here. What's nice about this is now my code is sort of sequestered into the header.js file, which means that if I want to change the header, I can logically come to my header.js file to make changes to my header. And I don't need to change how it's rendered down here because when I import it, I'm importing everything that I have in my header.js file, just like it was when it was declared here in the index.js file. Okay, let's get some practice. Let me type out your challenge. Simple enough. Just move the footer component and the main content component into their own files, and then of course do what you need to do to make it so that our site doesn't break down. Pause the screencast and work on this challenge. Okay, let's do this. I'm just going to cut my footer out, create a new file called F footer.js, paste my code in, and we'll import React from React so that our JSX works, and then I'll export default my footer function, my footer component, and make sure that I import it here, say import footer from footer, and just by importing it, now my footer should just be working the same way as it was. I'll hit refresh and everything is working. Awesome. We'll do the same thing for main content, and I can clean up some of these extra lines, create a new component or file called main content.js, paste it in, export default, import React from React, and of course we haven't yet imported it, so we will import it, main content, hit save, and we're back up and running. can remove this challenge, and all of a sudden we're down to 17 lines of code. We're importing these components from other files, and that way we have a much better organization on our app here. Again, like I said, there's a million different ways to organize your code. It's also not uncommon for people to even take this component that's sort of organizing our other components and put it in its own file. A lot of times, instead of calling it page, they'll call it app. That's actually the convention I tend to use. So maybe I'll go ahead and just change this to app while I'm at it. But because of the limited size of this project, I'm not terribly concerned about moving this component into its own file and then also importing all of those other components into that separate file. It just feels like maybe over-engineering it for such a small project. Okay, awesome work. Hopefully this has been helpful. We're going to be using organization like this throughout the rest of this course. So again, if you're feeling confused about how we're exporting things or importing them, then you may want to spend some time researching export and import in ES6 just to become a little more familiar with it. Or another great way to do that would be to just play with this code. See if you can delete these lines, delete the export default line, and just try to recreate it. See if you can get it to work again. When you feel comfortable with everything we've covered so far, let's keep moving forward. Earlier in the course, we saw how we could get a try to recreate. Feel comfortable with everything we've covered so far? Let's keep moving forward. There are practically innumerable ways to Earlier in the course, we saw how we could get a local React app up and running just using that in-browser Babel transpiler. Of course, at the same time, we also saw that it sent us a warning that said, essentially, you really shouldn't do it this way in production. This is okay for now, but eventually you'll want to do something different. So in this lesson, we're going to learn how we can use Vite, which is a tool that we'll use to actually create a local React app. This way, it will be a lot more primed for actually bundling and pushing something to production eventually if you were creating some kind of app that you actually wanted to deploy. As a tool, Vite will take care of the transpilation or the compilation phase, which is what will take our more updated versions of JavaScript that we get to write as developers and translate it into something that is more widely supported amongst all the major browsers out there. And it will also take care of the bundling. I've put here a list of some popular bundlers, and if we were to dive into the details of it, Webpack, Parcel, and Rollup are all bundling systems, whereas ESBuild will use a more updated way to use ES modules and really deploy something in a much quicker way. Under the hood, Vite is going to use ESBuild, which gives Vite such a fast response time when you're just developing locally. If any of you have used Create React App in the past, you'll know that when you run your npm install and npm start after using Create React App to get everything set up, it oftentimes will take somewhere between 30 seconds or even up to maybe 2 minutes or more to get things running. With Vite using ESBuild under the hood, we're going to see it take a matter of seconds instead of minutes, which is an amazing improvement in the developer experience. So that's enough of me blabbing. Let's move forward and see how we can actually do this. You can click the screenshot here, which will take you to the Vite homepage, and it is pronounced Vite, which is French for quick or fast. And in order to actually use Vite, you will need to make sure that you have Node and npm installed on your machine. You can do this by opening your terminal and typing node -v to check for a version of Node. If you do have Node, it will spit out some kind of version. It likely won't be the same version that I got when I took the screenshot. And usually if you have Node, you will also automatically have npm, but just in case, you can also run npm -v to make sure that it spits out a version there. If you do not have Node or npm installed, you can follow the instructions that we'll talk about next. If you do, then you can kind of gloss over these next few steps. Now, I'm not actually going to show you how to install Node because there's a million YouTube videos out there that you can use. If you click on the screenshot, it will take you directly to this search, install Node.js with NVM. And that's the important part. I really recommend people install Node.js using NVM, which is short for the Node Version Manager. I've also set it up here so that you can click on this screenshot if you want to install it on macOS or Linux, and you can click on this screenshot if you want to install it on Windows. They are very similar to each other, although the API is not perfectly the same. Once you've gone through the instructions there to install NVM, you can use NVM to install the latest version of Node and npm by simply running nvm install --lts. Again, this is specific to Mac and Linux. It is slightly different for Windows. Make sure you follow your system's specific instructions. Then once that completes, you should then be able to run node-v and npm-v and get some versions. Again, it's probably not going to be these exact same versions that it was for me when I recorded this. Okay, with installing Node and npm out of the way, we're ready to use Vite. If you click the screenshot here, it will take you to the Getting Started page on Vite's website. But the important part here is that in your terminal, you will type npm create Vite at latest. Make sure not to include this $sign. That's just the prompt that's already in your terminal. And when you do that, it's going to use Vite to ask a couple questions on your project. You can give your project its own name. Then it will have you select a framework. We're going to be using React. Once you select React, you can choose whether you want just vanilla JavaScript React or React with TypeScript. For our purposes in this course, we'll just be using React without TypeScript. And once it's done, which believe me, it will happen very quickly, it's going to give you some instructions. And so you'll just type in these 3 instructions as 3 separate commands in your terminal. When you do that, you should get something similar to this, where it will install all the associated packages with your React app and it will get things up and running. To run it, you'll write npm run dev, which is that 3rd instruction down there. And what's amazing about this is you can see that it was able to spin everything up in just over 1 second. That's truly incredible. If you've ever used Create React App, it's amazing. Now, if you go to localhost 3000 in a browser, you'll see the default app that spins up automatically. This has the code from Vite that is a bit of boilerplate code. At this point, you're welcome to essentially delete everything or just to work within the system that it gave you. Now, let's say, for example, I wanted to change the default logo from this React logo to be a Scrimba logo. All I have to do is change my logo PNG to something else. I, of course, have to have this inside of my project. The / means that it's in the same folder as my app.jsx file. And just like regular development, I can add things like a new paragraph tag. So now I have the Scrimba logo and a little paragraph that says, hello, Scrimba React students. Now, some of you might be looking at this line 3 that says import logo from scrimbalogo.png and wondering what the heck is going on there. In fact, if you look down here on line 12, it says that the source is equal to logo. This might seem a little strange if your only exposure to React has been here inside of Scrimba. However, this is the way that you would end up doing this if you're developing React locally. The reason is because when these files get all bundled and squished pushed together into a single JavaScript file, any path that you may have included is going to be different in the bundled version. By importing our images, we're able to teach the bundler in the final version that we end up bundling for production where to actually find those, and it will readjust those paths according to its needs. If that doesn't make sense, honestly, that's perfectly okay. It's just important to know that if you're following along in your local environment with what we're doing in Scrimba, anytime you see me use a relative path alone, maybe directly in my source, you're going to have to take one extra step and import the image from that relative path. The name here, logo, this is not important. You could call it blah, blah, blah if you wanted, as long as you then set your image source to blah, blah, blah. It's just a variable name. So once again, the first thing you would do is to import whatever your image is and give it a name from your relative path, and then to set your image source to be whatever that name you gave it. Now let's see this in action just to really reinforce what we're learning here. Let's say I wanted to add an image of a pizza. The first thing I would have to do is to import that pizza logo, which I can call it whatever. I've chosen pizza here, from pizza.png. You can see in my file tree, I actually have that image here, pizza.png. And then down in the image, I simply set the source equal to my curly brackets with the variable name that I chose when I was importing it. And it's as simple as that. I've added some styling here to make sure it wasn't an overly large image, but that's a completely separate story. Well, actually referring to that, I did that styling by adding an inline style tag here just for simplicity. But while we're at it, let's talk about importing styles as well. You may have noticed this line down below that just says import./app.css, and that might look a little bit strange, but the concept is essentially the same. Under the hood, this is teaching the bundler how to find the correct CSS file. When I import the CSS file name, and you'll notice I don't even have to give it a variable name like I did with my images, it will teach the bundler how to find that CSS file and make sure that it is applied to any JavaScript in the React tree below this point. I'm not at this time going to dive deep into how to do modularized styles and everything like that. For now, it's important to know that if I do have a CSS file that I want to associate with my React app, I will at some point need to import it just like you see here. Okay, I know we covered a lot, but now you should be all set. I hope that you've had a chance to follow along with this, and if not, I'd recommend going back and rewatching this, seeing how you can spin up a local React app using Vite, because doing so is just going to make you that much more experienced in what the real workflow is going to look like. Now, I still recommend that you do all of the little mini challenges and everything that we give you directly here in the Scrimba environment, and that's because I'm going to have things set up perfectly for you. I really want you to be focusing on learning the syntax of React and not necessarily worrying about all of the tooling that's required behind the scenes to get it to work locally. That said, I do want you to practice with it. You could decide to do your solo projects maybe as a local React app that you set up with Vite, and then do all of the other challenges that I give you directly here in the Scrimba environment. I'm going to leave that up to you to whatever makes the most sense for your own learning. Okay, that was a really big but still pretty important aside. Let's jump right back into learning more React. One thing that I really like to do when I'm starting a new project, especially if I have the design right in front of me like we do here, is to make a sort of mental outline of the elements on the page and how I'm going to lay this project out. All that really helps me do is to make a sort of mental model of how I'm going to create everything on the page. This can be especially helpful when you're thinking about layout and how you're going to place certain elements in the right spot on the page, especially when you start thinking in terms of using Flexbox or Grid to do that kind of layout. So as a first sort of mini challenge, what I want you to do is pause the screencast and look at this page, try to determine what kind of elements you would use, what kinds of CSS layouts you might use. Fortunately, this project has a fairly simple layout, but I still think that it's something that will be helpful for you to practice. So pause the screencast and try to imagine what elements you would use and how you would lay them out for this project. There's certainly more than one way to lay out any given page, but the way that I see this is having two primary sections, the top section, which is sort of a nav bar, and the bottom section, which is sort of the main content. Inside that nav bar, we have a little React logo, the React Facts logo text up here, and then a little blurb about what project this is in this course. Already, I can start to see that I'm probably going to choose to lay this out with Flexbox because that's a really easy way to make sure everything's in a nice, neat line. And with Flexbox, all I need to do to push this text all the way to the right is to give an auto margin to my React Facts text here, or rather a margin right of auto, so that it pushes this React Course Project 1 text all the way to the right side of my navigation bar. Then down below, it looks like I just have an H1 and an unordered list with some list items. So with this kind of mental outline, I can start putting together what the actual elements will look like on the page. I usually end up creating some kind of container div, so we'll call it a div with the class of container. There's certainly more than one way to lay out any given page, but the way that I see this is having two primary sections, the top section, which is sort of a nav bar, and the bottom section, which is sort of the main content. Inside that nav bar, we have a little React logo, the React Facts logo text up here, and then a little blurb about what project this is in this course. Already, I can start to see that I'm probably going to choose to lay this out with Flexbox because that's a really easy way to make sure everything's in a nice, neat line. And with Flexbox, all I need to do to push this text all the way to the right is to give an auto margin to my React Facts text here, or rather a margin right of auto, so that it pushes this React Course Project 1 text all the way to the right side of my navigation bar. Then down below, it looks like I just have an H1 and an unordered list with some list items. So with this kind of mental outline, I can start putting together what the actual elements will look like on the page. I usually end up creating some kind of container div, so we'll call it a div with the class of container, and this will just surround my whole page. And then we have our main two sections, that nav bar, which we saw at the top, and the main section. Inside the nav bar, we had a couple elements like the image, and then maybe let's call the React Facts text an H3 and this React Course Project 1 an H4. And then in the main section, there was our H1 and an unordered list with some list items inside. Now, in terms of React, this can be a really helpful exercise because I can start to see that I will probably have two main components. First, a custom nav component, which will house my nav element with its children elements. And second, a main custom component, which will house my H1 and my unordered list with the list items. In terms of those nested items, like the image and H3, those are going to be simple enough that they won't need their own custom React component. And then I would take my custom nav component and my custom main component and probably collect them together in one more custom component, which I usually end up calling app. And that will be what renders my div with the class of container. And then that app component, since it contains all the elements on my project, will then be rendered with React.render. So I hope this has been a helpful exercise for you, at least to see the way that I usually like to break down my projects. If it's a layout that's fairly basic like this, I usually will just kind of think about it ahead of time without actually writing it down or putting a bunch of dotted squares around the elements or anything like that. But once you've practiced this enough times, a simple layout like this might take you a total of maybe 10 seconds to think through, but in the end could end up saving you a lot of time. So now it's time for us to get your hands on the keyboard. We're going to have a series of challenges, which will help you be the one that actually builds out this project. Let's start by getting some of the project setup out of the way. I've written some step-by-step instructions here in the challenge. It is going to be a little bit more involved because we're creating everything completely from scratch, or almost completely from scratch. So your challenge is to create a components folder, and this components folder is going to have two files in it, the navbar.js file and the main.js file. For now, they should just render an h1 that says something like navbar goes here and main section here. Then I want you to create an app component, which will be outside of the components folder, and have the app component render the navbar and main components that you just created. Then inside of this file, the index.js, you will import the app component and then use react-dom.render to render that. The last step is to go and get the enter Google font, specifically with the weights of 400, 600, and 700. Once you've selected those font weights, you should see a series of link tags that you can use to put inside of our index.html. Make sure to put them above style.css so that we can reference them in style.css. And if you haven't used Google Fonts before, this one might take a little bit of extra research outside of Scrimba here to learn more about. But I know that you can do it. Fortunately, Google Fonts makes it relatively easy. Just know that you can ignore the @import or any npm options it talks about for installing this font. Remember, we're not dealing with any kind of styling right now. So by the end of this challenge, you'll just have a basic white page that just shows navbar here and main section here or something like that. So pause now and work on this challenge. Okay, let's just go one step at a time. We'll first create a new folder called components, and inside components, we can create a new file for main.js and navbar.js. As always, we will import React from React, and we will export default our navbar function, our navbar component. And for now, this is just going to return an h1 that, let's have it say navbar component. Then our main.js is going to be almost identical. We'll just copy this, paste it in, and instead of navbar component, we'll say main component, and we'll call this element the main element. Okay, I'll hit save. This is just going to bring up my preview window, but that's still empty. So I need to create a new file called app.js. And inside of app.js, again, we'll import React from React. We'll also import our navbar component from ./components/navbar. And we'll do the same thing for main, so I'll just duplicate that line and change navbar to main. Then this app component, we will export directly here with export default function app. And we will just have this return. Well, we want our navbar to be in here, so we'll say navbar, and we want our main component to be in here. But I want you to think for a second, what's wrong with the way that I've done this? We can see there's a syntax error. So what's wrong with the way that I've set this up? Inside of components, we can only return a single element. That element can have children elements, but right now we're trying to have two sort of side-by-side components. So what we need to do is wrap those in some kind of container like a div. So I'll move this div around and indent those. If you remember from the last screencast, we talked about how this would probably just be set up as a container. So we'll give it a class name of container. We're not going to deal with any styling now, but I might as well add that. React is not a scary library to be working with. So let's see how we can set up React. Now, I like to think of there as being an easy way to set up React in your project and a correct way of setting React up in your project. For our sake in learning, we're going to start with the easy way, which will also make it so that you can actually just do this in your local environment. Hopefully you're following along here on scrimba.com, but if you're curious and you're interested, you can always do this on your local environment as well. Now you can see I have a very basic HTML page set up. Class name since I know I'm going to need it. Okay, let's go check out our challenge and see where we are so far. So I created a components folder. I created the navbar and main components already. I created my app component, which is rendering the navbar and main components. So here we are. Let's import and render the app component here. I will import app from ./app. Oh, and I am going to be using some JSX syntax, so I also need to import React from React. And in our index.js, I will also be using React DOM. So I need to import React DOM from React DOM. And then I'll use React DOM.render to render my app component, which I just imported. And we're going to put it inside of the element with the ID of root. So we'll use document.getElementById root. And let's hit save and see if we get our elements showing up on the page. Awesome. Navbar component, main component, just like we expected. Okay, so that completes this part of the challenge. And then the last thing was to go to Google Fonts to get the inter font. Hopefully this wasn't too terribly tricky. Going to Google Fonts will give you a couple link elements. So I'm just going into my index.html, and above my style.css, I will just paste in those link elements. You can see that we have this pre-connected Google Fonts, this one to gstatic, but then this one is for our actual fonts. Here you can see the font family is inter, and it shows our weights of 400, 600, and 700 there. Again, I'm putting this above my style.css so that inside of my style.css, I can reference the font family of inter, and my browser will have already read these other link tags to know exactly what the inter font is. Okay, let's go back here, and we have finished everything from this challenge. I'll just do a little bit of cleanup. Now, we did just cover a lot of ground. However, every step that we did here was something that you should have already been able to do, maybe with exception to the Google Fonts if you've never dealt with Google Fonts before. So if you did find yourself struggling to get some of this basic setup done, that might be a good signal to you that it's time to go back and restudy and especially repractice some of the past challenges that we've done instead of just kind of plowing ahead in this course. The reason for that is because I'm essentially going to assume that you understood how this works from here on. And the last thing that I would want for you as you're learning React is to just continue on without actually having learned some of these basic setup principles. Okay, let's jump into maybe something a little more fun, and that is adding some actual styling and elements to our project. But before we move on, I wanted to give you one more opportunity to access the Figma design file. We talked about this much earlier in this section, but since it's been a while, I figured this would be a good reminder. If you click on the screenshot here, it will take you to the Figma file where you can get access to the design elements for this, like the colors, the spacing, the fonts, and everything like that. When you click on this link, it will take you to a shared version of this. However, if you'd like, you can avoid seeing everyone else's cursors and selections by clicking on the little arrow at the top and choosing to duplicate this to your drafts. That'll make it so that you aren't seeing everyone else's cursors and selections, but also so that you can make changes to it if you'd like. Okay, let's do it. Let's jump right in and start working on the navbar portion of our project. Hey there, I'm jumping in at this point to let you know that I've created a very quick Figma tutorial. Throughout this course and many others here on Scrimba, we're going to be providing you with a Figma design file, and I do think you'll find Figma fairly intuitive, but I thought it would be a good idea to just record a quick tutorial to help you along. The first thing you'll have to do is go over to figma.com and create a new account. And as I was signing up for a second account just to kind of test this process, I realized that there's actually a lot of steps, so I figured I would walk you through it. First, you're going to click sign up. You'll obviously either sign up with Google or you can provide an email and password. I believe if you provide an email and password, it will have you go verify your email, so it'll send you an email to verify. Once you've done that and you come back, it will have you choose which kind of plan you want. Figma has a really generous free tier, so I would just start for free. You'll click that button down there. When it asks you to tell you about your team, you can at this point honestly just say skip this step. And then when it says what would you like to do first, I just think it's easiest to say I'll explore by myself. And when you do that, it's going to drop you into the Figma interface. Now from that point on, I've actually recorded a whole tutorial using the Figma program that is now over on the Scrimba YouTube channel. So at this point, you're going to continue onto YouTube by clicking on the screenshot here, which will take you to the video that I recorded. And hopefully that quick introduction to Figma will really help make things easier for you as you use Figma as a part of your Scrimba coursework. So click on the screenshot you see here, head over to YouTube. When you've watched that video and you're done, you can close that window, come back here to Scrimba and continue on in this course. Okay, this is the fun part. We're actually going to make our navigation bar look the way that it looks in the design. A couple pieces of advice. I highly recommend you reference the Figma file that contains all of the fonts, colors, spacing, and everything instead of just looking at this quick reference that I've put here, but this is meant to be just a quick reference for you if you need it. Another thing is I have added a couple of base styles to our styles.css. I ran into some problems trying to record this without putting my box sizing, and just because it helps a lot, I'm going to remove the margin on the body, especially to make our navigation bar go all the way to the edges. Also notice that I have included the React icon small image here inside of the images folder. You can see that's part of the design up here in the upper left. So without further ado, pause the screencast and make the navigation bar look as close to our design as you can. All right, let's do this. Instead of rendering an H1, I'm going to open this up and render a nav element because this is a navigation bar. And inside there, we know we have an image. We'll give it its source while we're here. I have to use //images because I'm inside of the components folder when I'm here in the nav bar. And it's React icon small.png. Let's just refresh and see if that's in the nav bar. And it's React icon small.png. Let's just refresh and see if that's working. Okay, cool. And let's call this maybe an H3, I guess, and maybe this an H4. It really doesn't matter because, well, you could just give it a class name and call it paragraph, but I'll just call it an H3 and H4. This one says React Facts, and this one says React Course -Project 1. Okay, refresh that, and we've got our elements on the screen. Now, we talked about earlier how the nav bar will probably be a flexbox container. So I think because I'm only going to have one nav element on my screen, I'm just going to style the element nav. If you want, you could always give it a class name as well. I'm going to put display flex. We'll say align items in the center. From the design, we can find that the background color is this color here. It also looks like it has about 30 pixels of padding on the top and bottom and 25 pixels of padding on the left and right. And we can also see from the design that it has a height of about 90 pixels. Okay, so it doesn't look like our top and bottom margin is applying, and I suspect that's either because our image is a little bit too large, or I think maybe more likely because our H3 and H4 here have some top and bottom margin by default. So I think I might just select the H3 directly inside of the nav. Let's say margin is 0, and then let's see if that also works for the H4. Okay, it might be that the image is just a little too large. Let's take a look at the image, and it looks like from the design it's got a height of about 30 pixels. Okay, so maybe our padding is doing fine, and it was just that the image was a little bit large. While we're here dealing with the image, I'm going to give it a margin right, just to bump it away from the text there a little bit. We'll say, I think the design shows it's about 7 pixels. That looks pretty good. And let's go ahead and use the margin right of auto on our H3 just to bump that H4 all the way to the right side. Cool. All right, well, while we're working on that, we can go ahead and give the color to our React facts. So we'll say the color is this color from the design. Okay, that does it for the color. Let's get the fonts right. And actually, I think all of the fonts on this page are Inter, so I'm just going to change that in the body. We'll say Inter, and then I think a backup of sans serif makes sense. Let me just comment this out. Yeah, okay, so that's making a difference. So awesome. Our Google fonts are coming through just fine. I can also see from the design that the React Facts logo words there have a font weight of 700. So we'll bold those up a little bit. Or maybe that's the default. Doesn't look like it's making much of a difference. And then let's do the same thing for our H4. It has this color from the design, and it looks like it has a font weight of 600. Okay, that's making a slight difference, so that's good. And it kind of looks to me like React Facts maybe needs to be a little bit bigger. And yeah, I can see from the design that it has a font size of something around 22 pixels. Okay, that's looking awesome. Now, when I can avoid it, I usually don't love to style things with their native components if I don't have to. Maybe just for practice sake, I'm going to go into my navbar and I'll start providing some class names here. So let's give a class name to everything on the page. Let's go class name equals, and then up here, maybe I'll use something kind of like BEM syntax. I'll say this is part of the nav block, and the element is the icon. And then we'll say this is the nav block, and the element is the, it's kind of like the logo text. And this one is part of the nav, and let's call it the, maybe like the title of our project here. And what's nice about that is I don't have to do these kind of nested selectors anymore. My H3 was nav logo text, and I can also select my nav title and change these other selectors as well. And one thing I've learned about Scrimba is I have to make sure I save this when I change my class names before I come to the CSS. Otherwise, the CSS updates live, but the markup does not. So once I hit refresh there, that kind of put everything back the way it was. Awesome. This is a really excellent start. Frankly, most of what we did here was just CSS instead of actually doing React. But my goal with this course is not just to focus entirely on React. I want to synthesize some of the information you have been learning so far, including revisiting the CSS and markup and stuff like that as much as we can. Frankly, in this first section of the course, we aren't doing much of the detailed side of React. We mostly have just learned some of the very basic syntax. But I think it's important for us to kind of remind ourselves of the past information we've learned by practicing it here. So the next thing we're going to do is fill out the body section here, or the main section here. There's a couple of gotchas with this that we're going to actually address later. But whenever you feel good about everything we've done here in this challenge, then let's move on to the next one. Okay, this is the fun part. We're actually going to make our navigation bar look the way that it looks in the design. A couple pieces of advice. I highly recommend you reference the Figma fo. Once I hit refresh there, that kind of put everything back the way it was. Awesome. This is a really excellent start. Frankly, most of what we did here was just CSS instead of actually doing React. But my goal with this course is not just to focus entirely on React. I want to synthesize some of the information you have been learning so far, including revisiting the CSS and markup and stuff like that as much as we can. Frankly, in this first section of the course, we aren't doing much of the detailed side of React. We mostly have just learned some of the very basic syntax. But I think it's important for us to kind of remind ourselves of the past information we've learned by practicing it here. So the next thing we're going to do is fill out the body section here, or the main section here. There's a couple of gotchas with this that we're going to actually address later. But whenever you feel good about everything we've done here in this challenge, then let's move on to the next one. Okay, this is the fun part. We're going to actually address later. But whenever you feel good about everything we've done here in this challenge, then let's move on to the next one. Okay, this is the fun part. We're actually going